Are we ready? Are we in the vibe for a 1921 book? All right, so this is Vera by Elizabeth von Arnim. Chapter 1. When the doctor had gone, and the two women from the village he had been waiting for were upstairs shut in with her dead father, Lucy went out into the garden and stood leaning on the gate, staring at the sea. Her father had died at 9 o'clock that morning, and it was now 12. The sun beat on her bare head, and the burnt-up grass along the top of the cliff, and the dusty road that passed the gate, and the glittering sea, and the few white clouds hanging in the sky, all blazed and glared in an extremity of silent, motionless heat and light. Into this emptiness Lucy stared, motionless herself as if she had been carved in stone. There was not a sail on the sea, nor a line of distant smoke from any steamer. Neither was there once the flash of a bird's wing brushing across the sky. Movement seemed smitten rigid. Sound seemed to have gone to sleep. Lucy stood staring at the sea, her face as empty of expression as the bright, blank world before her. Her father had been dead 3 hours, and she felt nothing. It was just a week since they had arrived in Cornwall, she and he, full of hope, full of pleasure in the pretty little furnished house they had taken for August and September, full of confidence in the good the pure air was going to do him. But there had always been confidence. There had never been a moment during the long years of his fragility when the confidence had even been questioned. He was delicate, and she had taken care of him. She had taken care of him, and he had been delicate ever since she could remember. And ever since she could remember, he had been everything in her life. She had had no thought since she grew up for anybody but for her father. There was no room for any other thought. So completely did he fill her heart. They had done everything together, shared everything together, dodged the winters together, settled in charming places, seen the same beautiful things, read the same books, talked, laughed, had friends, heaps of friends. Wherever they were, her father seemed at once to have friends, adding them to the mass he already had. She had not been away from him a day for years. She had had no wish to go away. Where and with whom could she be so happy as with him? All the years were years of sunshine. There had been no winters, nothing but summer. Summer and sweet scents and soft skies and patient understanding with her slowness, for he had the nimblest mind and love. He was the most amusing companion to her, the most generous friend, the most illuminating guide, the most adoring father. And now he was dead, and she felt nothing. Her father, dead, forever. She said the words over to herself. They meant nothing. She was going to be alone, without him, always. She said the words over to herself. They meant nothing. Up in that room with its windows wide open, shut away from her with the two village women, he was lying dead. He had smiled at her for the last time, said all he was ever going to say to her, called her the last of the sweet, half-teasing names he loved to invent for her. Why, only a few hours ago they were having breakfast together and planning what they would do that day. Why, only yesterday they drove together after tea towards the sunset, and he had seen, with his quick eyes that saw everything, some unusual grasses by the roadside, and had stopped and gathered them, excited to find such rare ones, and had taken them back with him to study, and had explained them to her, and made her see profoundly interesting, important things in them, in these grasses which, till he touched them, had seemed just grasses. That is what he did with everything. Touched it into life and delight. It's getting real cheerful over here. Oh, I didn't know you wanted a happy book. The grasses lay in the dining room now, waiting for him to work on them, spread out where he had put them on some blotting paper in the window. She had seen them as she came through on her way to the garden, and she had seen, too, that the breakfast was still there, the breakfast they had had together, still as they had left it, forgotten by the servants in the surprise of death. He had fallen down as he got up from it, dead, in an instant, no time for anything, for a cry, for a look, gone, finished, wiped out. You have pizza, cheese sticks, and Diet Pepsi. Perfect. Settle in. This is a real depressing start to to a book. What you've missed so far, Noodles. Our main character, Lucy, well, I'm assuming she's our main character. I don't really know. Has her dad just died at 9 a.m. Awesome. Love some good depression. Yeah, her dad died at 9 a.m. It's now noon, and she's like, I feel nothing. And is going through, like, the day and, like, the remembrances of, like, how much her dad meant to her, that sort of thing. We're on page, like, 3, and it's been nothing but happy times. Ah, so 2013. Ah, yes. Okay. What a beautiful day it was, and so hot. He loved heat. They were lucky in this weather. Yes, there were sounds, after all. She suddenly noticed them. Sounds from the room upstairs, a busy moving about of discreet footsteps, the splash of water, crockery being carefully set down. Presently the women would come and tell her everything was ready, and she could go back to him. The women had tried to comfort her when they arrived, and so had the servants, and so had the doctor. Comfort her. And she felt nothing. Lucy stared at the sea, thinking these things, examining the situation as a curious one, but unconnected with herself, looking at it with a kind of cold comprehension. Her mind was quite clear. Every detail of what had happened was sharply before her. She knew everything, and she felt nothing. Like God, she said to herself. Yes, exactly like God. Oh, Noodles, I'm so sorry. 10 years. It's wild how fast time goes. Yeah. Also, El Prue, hello. Welcome in. Glad you're here. Footsteps came along the road, which was hidden by the garden's fringe of trees and bushes for 50 yards on either side of the gate, and presently a man passed between her eyes and the sea. She did not notice him, for she was noticing nothing but her thoughts, and he passed in front of her quite close, and was gone. But he had seen her, and had stared hard at her for the brief instant it took to pass the gate. Her face and its expression had surprised him. He was not a very observant man, and at that moment was even less so than usual, for he was particularly and deeply absorbed in his own affairs. Yet when he came suddenly on the motionless figure at the gate, with its wide-open eyes that simply looked through him as he went by, unconscious, obviously, that anyone was going by, his attention was surprised away from himself, and almost he had stopped to examine the strange creature more closely. His code, however, prevented that, and he continued along the further 50 yards of bushes and trees that hid the other half of the garden from the road, but more slowly, slower and slower, till at the end of the garden where the road left it behind and went on very solitarily over the bare grass on the tops of the cliffs, winding in and out with the ins and outs of the coast, for as far as one could see, he hesitated, looked back, went on a yard or two, hesitated, again, stopped and took off his hot hat, and wiped his forehead, looked at the bare country and the long twisting glare of the road ahead, and then very slowly turned and went past the belt of bushes towards the gate again. Oh, thank you, Long Souls. He said to himself as he went, My God, I'm so lonely. I can't stand it. I must speak to someone. I shall go off my head. For what had happened to this man? His name was, I should have looked up how to say this name. Wemyss? Wemyss? Here, I'm gonna put it in chat. Please tell me if you've seen this name before, because I absolutely do not. I don't think I've ever seen this name before. Wemyss? I don't know how to say it. And I feel like he's gonna be like a main person, and I'm gonna have to say this name all the time, and I'm gonna feel so silly saying it wrong literally every single time. Let's see. Let's see how to pronounce the name Wemyss. Wemyss. Okay. Weems. It is. Thank you, Noodles. Thank you. Okay, it's pronounced Weems. Okay. I can say that. Hello, Defo Human. Hello, hello. Thank you for the follow. Okay. I can handle saying Weems. Okay. For what had happened to this man, his name was Weems, was that public opinion was forcing him into retirement and inactivity at the very time when he most needed company and distraction. He had to go away by himself. He had to withdraw for, at the very least, a week from his ordinary life, from his house on the river where he had just begun his summer holiday, from his house in London where at least there were clubs, because of his determination on the part of public opinion that he should for a space be alone with his sorrow. Alone with sorrow. Of all ghastly things for a man to be alone with. It was an outrage, he felt, to condemn a man to that. It was the cruelest form of solitary confinement. He had come to Cornwall because it took a long time to get to. A whole day in the train there and a whole day in the train back, clipping the week, the minimum of time public opinion insisted on for respecting his bereavement at both ends. But still, that left 5 days of awful loneliness, of wandering about the cliffs by himself, trying not to think, without a soul to speak to, without a thing to do. He couldn't play bridge because of public opinion. Everybody knew what had happened to him. It had been in all the papers. The moment he said his name, they would know. It was so recent. Only last week. No, he couldn't bear this. He must speak to someone. That girl, with those strange eyes, she wasn't just ordinary. She wouldn't mind letting him talk to her for a little, perhaps sit in the garden with her a little. She would understand. Weems was like a child in his misery. Romeo, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Hello, hello. Devo, I'm just now reading the conversation with Devo. I see you are a person of great taste. Excellent. uh, Oh man, I got way too excited. Okay, the girl with the strange eyes, there we go. She would understand. Okay, Weems was like a child in his misery. He very nearly cried outright when he got to the gate and took off his hat, and the girl looked at him blankly, just as if she still didn't see him and hadn't heard him when he said, "Could you let me have a glass of water? It's so hot." He began to stammer because of her eyes. I'm horribly thirsty. The heat. He pulled out his handkerchief and mopped his forehead. He certainly looked very hot. His face was red and distressed, and his forehead dripped. He was all puckered, like an unhappy baby. And the girl looked so cool, so bloodlessly cool. Her hands, folded on the top bar of the gate, looked more than cool. They looked cold, like hands in winter, shrunk and small with cold. She had bobbed hair, he noticed, so that it was impossible to tell how old she was. Brown hair from which the sun was beating out bright lights, and her small face had no color except those wide eyes fixed on his, and the color of her rather big mouth. But even her mouth seemed frozen. "Would it be much bother?" began Weems again, and then his situation overwhelmed him. "You would be doing a great kindness, then, you know," he said, his voice trembling with unhappiness, If you would let me come into the garden a minute and rest. The sound of the genuine wretchedness in his voice, Lucy's blank eyes became a little human. It got through to her consciousness that this distressed, warm stranger was appealing to her for something. Are you so hot? She asked, really seeing him for the first time. Yes, I'm hot, said Weems, but it isn't that. I've had a misfortune, a terrible misfortune. He paused, overcome by the remembrance of it, by the unfairness of so much horror having overtaken him. Oh, I'm sorry, said Lucy vaguely, still miles away from him, deep in indifference. Have you lost anything? Good God, not that sort of misfortune, cried Weems. Let me come in a minute. Into the garden a minute. Just to sit for a minute with a human being. You would be doing a great kindness. Because you're a stranger, I can talk to you about it if you'll let me. Just because we're strangers, I could talk. I haven't spoken to a soul but servants and official people since it happened. For 2 days, I haven't spoken at all to a living soul. I shall go mad. His voice shook again with his unhappiness, with his astonishment at his unhappiness. Lucy didn't think 2 days very long not to speak to anybody in, but there was something overwhelming about the strange man's evident affliction that roused her out of her apathy. Not much. She was still profoundly detached, observing from another world, as it were, this extreme heat and agitation. But at least she saw him now. She did, with a faint curiosity, consider him. He was like some elemental force in his directness. He had the quality of an irresistible natural phenomenon. But she did not move from her position at the gate, and her eyes continued, with the unwaveringness he thought so odd, to stare into his. I would gladly have let you come in, she said, if you had come yesterday. But today my father died. Weems looked at her in astonishment. She had said it in a level and ordinary a voice, as if she had been remarking, rather indifferently, on the weather. Then he had a moment of insight. His own calamity had illuminated him. He had never known pain, who had never let himself be worried, who had never let himself be approached in this life by doubt, had for the last week lived in an atmosphere of worry and pain, and of what, if he allowed himself to think, to become morbid, might well grow into a most unfair, tormenting doubt. He understood, as he would not have understood a week ago, what her whole attitude, her rigidity, meant. He stared at her a moment, while she stared straight back at him, and then his big warm hands dropped onto the cold ones folded on the top bar of the gate, and he said, holding them firmly, though they made no attempt to move, "So that's it. That's why. Now, I know." And then he added, with the simplicity his own situation was putting into everything he did, "That settles it. We're two stricken ones must talk together." And still covering her hands with one of his, with the other, he unlatched the gate and walked in. End of chapter 1. So I'm loving the writing style. It's pretty great. I will not be doing a Scottish accent. I don't know if that's why y'all are here, but I am not doing a Scottish accent. He is rather entitled, absolutely. Yes. Just barging in. She's like, "No, like my dad like just died today," and he's like, "Ah, yes," and then touches her hand like, "Don't touch strangers. Don't do it. No, no." And then just walks into the garden. "Ah, yes, we must both share our wounds." No, it's rather presumptuous. Rich man feels sad for first time in life. Feels like he understands all misery now. That's like the headline. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Uh, I'm excited. I'm excited because I know the gist of the book, and I'm excited for what comes, for what happens. That feels like step away from yes. Yes, it does. Like, you can obviously tell that Lucy is trying to even just like process. Like, she's numb. She doesn't know what's going on. And he just comes in and just inserts himself into her life, into her garden. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. Do we already have our antagonist established? Maybe. Oof. All right. Let me have another sip. I'm taking swigs like it's not just tea. It's just tea. Gotta have another sip before we start the next chapter. Okay. Chapter 2. There was a seat under a mulberry tree on the little lawn, with its back to the house and the gaping windows, and Weems, spying it out, led Lucy to it as if she were a child, holding her by the hand. She went with him indifferently. What did it matter whether she sat under the mulberry tree or stood at the gate? This convulsed stranger, was he real? Was anything real? Let him tell her whatever it was he wanted to tell her, and she would listen, and get him his glass of water. And then he would go his way, and by that time the woman would have finished upstairs, and she could be with her father again. I'll fetch the water, she said, when they got to a seat. No, sit down, said Weems. She sat down. So did he, letting her hand go. It dropped on the seat, palm upwards, between them. It's strange our coming across each other like this, he said, looking at her while she looked indifferently straight in front of her at the sun, on the grass beyond the shade of the mulberry tree, at a mass of huge fuchsia bushes a little way off. I've been going through hell, and so must you have been. Good God, what hell? Do you mind if I tell you? You'll understand because of your own... Lucy didn't mind. She didn't mind anything. She merely vaguely wondered what he should think. She had been going through hell. Hell and her darling father. How quaint it sounded. She began to suspect that she was asleep. All this really wasn't happening. Her father wasn't dead. Presently the housemaid would come in with the hot water and wake her to the usual cheerful day. The man sitting beside her, he seemed rather vivid for a dream, it was true, so detailed, with his flushed face and the perspiration on his forehead, besides the feel of this big warm hand a moment ago and the small puffs of heat that came from his clothes when he moved. But it was so unlikely. Everything that had happened since breakfast was so unlikely. This man, too, would resolve himself soon into just something she had had for dinner last night, and she would tell her father about her dream at breakfast, and they would laugh. She stirred uneasily. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And coming across each other, like she wasn't just standing in her own yard. Yeah. How weird that we should just come across each other in this way. Yeah. Okay, Weems. You need to calm yourself. Fleshed face. Because that's a creepy thing to say, that's why. That is exactly why that creeps you out. Fleshed face. I think the word flesh is also a bit creepy. Just say skin. Hello, Hot God. Thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. But yeah, fleshed face is very creepy, and I don't like it. The story is unbelievably horrible, Weems was saying in high aggrievement, looking at her little head with a straight haircut and her grave profile. How old was she? 18? 28? Impossible to tell exactly with hair cut like that, but young, anyhow, compared to him. Very young, perhaps, compared to him who was well over 40 and so much scarred, so deeply scarred by this terrible thing that had happened to him. Do not use flesh in a pickup line. Please, Noodles, do not use flesh in a pickup line. Please. Or do, and then tell me how it goes. It's so horrible that I wouldn't talk about it if you were going to mind, he went on. But you can't mind because you're a stranger, and it may help you with your own trouble, because whatever you may suffer, I'm suffering much worse. So then you'll see yours isn't so bad. And besides, I must talk to someone. I should go mad. This was certainly a dream, thought Lucy. Things didn't happen like this when one was awake. Grotesque things. Weems is saying a lot of things and thinking a lot of things that I just don't like. She turned her head and looked at him. No, it wasn't a dream. No dream could be so solid as the man beside her. What was he saying? He was saying in a tormented voice that he was Weems. You are Weems, she repeated gravely. It made no impression on her. She didn't mind his being Weems. I'm the Weems the newspaper were full of last week, he said, seeing that the name left her unmoved. My God, he went on, again wiping his forehead, but as fast as he wiped it more beads burst out. Those posters, to see one's own name starting at one everywhere on posters. Why was your name on posters? Said Lucy. She didn't want to know. She asked mechanically, her ear attentive only to the sounds from the open windows of the room upstairs. Don't you read the newspapers here? Was his answer. I don't think that we do, she said, listening. We've been settling in. I don't think we've remembered to order any newspapers yet. A look of some, at any rate, relief from the pressure he was evidently struggling under came into Weems's face. Then I can tell you the real version, he said, without your being already filled up with the monstrous suggestions that were made at the inquest. As though I hadn't suffered enough as it was. As though it hadn't been terrible enough already. The inquest? Repeated Lucy. Again, she turned her head and looked at him. Has your trouble anything to do with death? Why, you don't suppose anything else would reduce me to the state I'm in? Oh, I'm sorry, she said, and into her eyes and into her voice came a different expression. Something living, something gentle. I hope it wasn't anybody you loved? Was my wife, said Weems. He got up quickly, so near was he to crying at the thought of it, at the thought of all he had endured, and turned his back on her and began stripping the leaves off the branches above his head. I'm like throwing in like the importance of being Weems. Lucy watched him, leaning forward a little on both hands. Tell me about it, she said presently, very gently. He came back and dropped down heavily beside her again, and with many interjections of astonishment that such a ghastly calamity could have happened to him who till now had never— Yes, said Lucy, comprehendingly and gravely. Yes, I know. Had never had anything to do with, well, with calamities, he told her the story. They had gone down, he said. They had gone down, he and his wife, as they did every 25th of July, for the summer to their house on the river, and he had been looking forward to a glorious time of peaceful doing nothing after months of London, just lying about in a punt and reading and smoking and resting. London was an awful place for tiring one out, and they hadn't been there 24 hours before his wife, the remembrance of it was too grievous to him. He couldn't go on. Was she very ill? Asked Lucy, gently, to give him time to recover. I think that would almost be better. One would be a little prepared. She wasn't ill at all, cried Weems. She just died. Oh, like father, exclaimed Lucy, roused now altogether. It was she now who laid her hand on his. Weems seized it between both his and went on quickly. He was writing letters, he said, in the library at his table in the window where he could see the terrace and the garden and the river. They had tea together only an hour before. There was a flagged terrace along that side of the house, the side the library was on, and all the principal rooms, and all of a sudden there was a great flash of shadow between him and the light, come and gone instantaneously, and instantaneously there was a thud. He would never forget it, that thud. And they were outside his window, on the flags. "Oh, don't! Oh, don't!" gasped Lucy. "It was my wife," Weems hurried on, not able now to stop, looking at Lucy while he talked, with eyes of amazed horror. "Fallen out of the top room of the house, her sitting room, because of the view. It was in a straight line with the library window. She dropped past my window like a stone." I'm so sorry. I did not realize that there were content warnings for suicide. I apologize, and I hope that this doesn't trigger anybody. I'm so sorry. "Oh, don't. Oh, now you can wonder at the state I'm in," he cried. "Can you wonder if I'm nearly off my head, and forced to be by myself, forced into retirement for what the world considers a proper period of mourning, with nothing to think of but that ghastly inquest?" He hurt her hand. He gripped it so hard. "If you hadn't let me come and talk to you," he said, "I believe I'd have pitched myself over the cliff there this afternoon and made an end of it. But how? But why? How could she fall?" whispered Lucy, to whom poor Weems's misfortune seemed more frightful than anything she had ever heard of. She hung on his words, her eyes on his face, her lips parted, her whole body in agony of sympathy. Life, how terrible it was, and how unsuspected. On, one went on, and on, never dreaming of the sudden dreadful day when the coverings were going to be dropped, and one would see it was death after all, that it had been death all the time, death pretending, death waiting. Times would come some yes in The Hobbit that you had to skip over being yes. Yeah, it's wild. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, The Hobbit is surprisingly very dark, very graphic, and doesn't always use great language that I think would be used today. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Strange, weird. Mm-hmm. Yep, yep. And it's hard to like do it on the fly sometimes when you're like so unsuspecting of it, for sure. Um, Her father, so full of love and interests and plans, gone, finished, brushed away as if he no more mattered than some insect one unseeingly treads on as one walks. And this man's wife, dead in an instant, dead so far more cruelly, so horribly. "I had often told her to be careful of that window," Weems answered in a voice that almost sounded like anger, but all the time his tone had been one of high anger at the wanton, outrageous cruelty of fate. "It was a very low one, and the floor was slippery. Oak. Every floor in my house is polished oak. I had them put I had them put in myself. She must have been leaning out and her feet slipped away behind her. That would make her fall head foremost." "Oh, oh," said Lucy, shrinking. What could she do? What could she say to help him, to soften at least these dreadful memories? "And then," Weems went on after a moment, so unaware as Lucy was that she was trembling, stroking his hand, "at the inquest, as though it hadn't all been awful enough for me already, the jury must actually get wrangling about the case of death. Or cause of death. The cause of death," echoed Lucy. But she fell. "Whether it were an accident or done on purpose. Done on suicide." "Oh." She drew in her breath quickly. "But it wasn't? How could it be? She was my wife, without a care in the world, everything done for her, no troubles, nothing on her mind, nothing wrong with her health. We had been married 15 years, and I was devoted to her. Devoted to her." He banged his knee with his free hand. His voice was full of indignant tears. "Then why did the jury—" "My wife had a fool of a maid. I never could stand that woman, and it was something she said at the inquest, some invention or other about what my wife had said to her. You know what servants are. It upset some of the jury. You know juries are made up of anybody and everybody, butcher, baker, and candlestick maker, quite uneducated, most of them, quite at the mercy of any suggestion. And so instead of a verdict of death by misadventure, which would have been the right one, it was an open verdict. Oh, how terrible! How terrible for you, breathed Lucy, her eyes on his, her mouth twitching with sympathy. You'd have seen all about it if you had read the papers last week, said Weems more quietly. It had done him good to get it out and talked over. He looked down at her upturned face with its horror-stricken eyes and twitching mouth. Now tell me about yourself, he said, touched with compunction. Nothing that had happened to her could be so horrible as what had happened to him. Still, she was too newly smitten. They had met on a common ground of disaster. Death himself had been their introducer. Is life all only death? She breathed, her horror-stricken eyes on his. Before he could answer, and what was there to answer to such a question except that, of course, it wasn't, and he and she were just victims of a monstrous special unfairness. He certainly was. Her father had probably died as fathers did, in the usual way in his bed. Before he could answer, the two women came out of the house, and with the small, discreet steps proceeded down the path to the gate. The sun flooded their spare figures, and their decent black clothes kept for these occasions as a mark of respectful sympathy. One of them saw Lucy under the mulberry tree and hesitated, and then came across the grass to her with the mincing steps of tact. Here's somebody coming to speak to you, said Weems, for Lucy was sitting with her back to the path. She started and looked round. The woman approached hesitatingly, her head on one side, her hands folded, her face pulled into a little smile intended to convey encouragement and pity. The gentleman's quite ready, miss, she said softly. End of chapter 2. All right. Let's see here. Taking a sip. Not sure about the vibes of this book so far. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll see. I know that it's supposed to be, like, suspenseful later on. I think it'll depend on whether we're supposed to be critical of Weems. Yes. Yes. If he's written as, like, we're supposed to be sympathetic with him, then I think that that's a very, very different reading than if we don't like him, or if we're not supposed to like him, for sure. Which I'm getting that we're not supposed to like him, but then we get this story with his wife. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I get that. I get that. Okay. Let's see here. A lot more talk about death than what the synopsis led me to believe. Maybe that comes later. We'll see. We'll see. We did read a book, what was it? The Last Man by, um, what's her name? I don't even remember. But we read a book, The Last Man, and it was supposed to be a plague book where, like, all of humanity is destroyed except for one man. And we read, like, 50% of it, 55% of it. I don't remember. And, like, nobody had died yet. No, not the graphic novel. No, I love the graphic novel. No, not that one. Mary Shelley, that's who it was. The Last Man by Mary Shelley. And Um, yeah, like nobody died, and it was like a completely different like story, what was actually happening than what the like synopsis like led everybody to believe. It was supposed to be like a science fiction, like apocalyptic story, but it was just very much political intrigue, and nothing happened. I was waiting for the plague to happen, and we never got to the plague, and we just like decided to stop reading it. So hopefully that's not what happens with this book, and it sort of like moves along to like the actual like what the synopsis is about. Um Hopefully. We'll see. All right, chapter 3. All that day and all the next day, Weems was Lucy's tower of strength and rock of refuge. He did everything that had to be done of the business part of death, that extra wantonness of misery thrown in so grimly to finish off the crushing of a mourner who is alone. It is true the doctor was kind and ready to help, but he was a complete stranger. She had never seen him till he was fetched that dreadful morning, and he had other things to see, too, besides her affairs. His own patients, scattered widely over a lonely countryside. Weems had nothing to see to. He could concentrate entirely on Lucy, and he was her friend, linked to her so strangely and so strongly by death. She felt she had known him forever. She felt that since the beginning of time, she and he had been advancing hand in hand towards just this place, towards just this house and garden, towards just this year, this August, this moment of existence. Weems dropped quite naturally into the place a near male relative would have been in if there had been a near male relative within reach, and his relief at having something to do, something practical and immediate, was so immense that never were funeral arrangements made with greater zeal and energy. Really, one might also say with greater gusto. Fresh from the horrors of those other funeral arrangements, clouded as they had been by the silences of friends and the averted looks of neighbors, all owing to the idiotic jurors and their hesitations, and the vindictiveness of that woman because, he concluded, he had refused to raise her wages the previous month. What he was arranging now was so simple and straightforward that it positively was a pleasure. There were no anxieties, there were no worries, and there was a grateful little girl. After each fruitful visit to the undertaker, and he paid several in her zeal, he came back to Lucy, and she was grateful. And she was not only grateful, but very obviously glad to get him back. He saw she didn't like it when he went away, off along the top of the cliff of his various business visits, purpose in each step, a different being from the indignantly miserable person who had dragged about that very cliff, killing time such a little while before. He could see she didn't like it. She knew he had to go. She was grateful and immensely expressive of her gratitude. Weems thought he had never met anyone so expressly grateful that he should so diligently go, but she didn't like it. He saw she didn't like it. He saw that she clung to him, and it pleased him. It totally escalated extremely quickly. Don't be long, she murmured each time, looking at him with eyes of entreaty, and when he got back and stood before her again, mopping his forehead, having triumphantly advanced the funeral arrangements another stage, a faint color came into her face, and she had the relieved eyes of a child who had been left alone in the dark and sees its mother coming in with a candle. Vera usedn't to look like that. Vera had accepted everything he did for her as a matter of course. Naturally, she wasn't going to let the poor little girl sleep alone in that house with a dead body, and the strange servants who had been hired together with the house and knew nothing either about her or her father, probably getting restive as night grew on, and as likely as not bolting to the village. So he fetched his things from the primitive hotel down in the cove about 7 o'clock, and announced his intention of sleeping on the drawing-room sofa. He had lunched with her, and had had tea with her, and now was going to dine with her. What she would have done without him, Weems couldn't think. He felt he was being delicate and tactful in this about the drawing-room sofa. He might fairly have claimed the spare-room bed, but he wasn't going to take any advantage, not the smallest, of the poor little girl's situation. The servants, who supposed him to be a relation and had supposed him to be that from the first moment they saw him, big and middle-aged, holding the young lady's hand under the mulberry tree, were surprised at having to make up a bed in the drawing-room when there were 2 spare rooms with beds already in them upstairs, but did so obediently, vaguely imagining it had something to do with watchful and French windows. And Lucy, when he told her he was going to stay the night, was so grateful, so really thankful, that her eyes, red from the waves of grief that had engulfed her at intervals during the afternoon, ever since, that is, the sight of her dead father lying so remote from her, so wrapped, it seemed, in a deep, absorbed attentiveness, had unfrozen her and swept her away into a sea of passionate weeping, filled again with tears. "Oh," she murmured, "how good you are." It was Weems who had done all the thinking for her, and in the spare moments between his visits to the undertaker about the arrangements, and to the doctor about the certificate, and to the vicar about the burial, had telegraphed to her only existing relative, an aunt, had sent the obituary notice to the Times, and had even reminded her that she had on a blue frock, and asked if she hadn't put on a black one. And now this last instance of his thoughtfulness overwhelmed her. She had been dreading the night, hardly daring to think of it, so much did she dread it, and each time he had gone away on his errands, through her heart crept the thought of what it would be like when dusk came, and he went away for the last time, and she would be alone, all alone in the silent house, and upstairs that strange, wonderful, absorbing thing that used to be her father, and whatever happened to her, whatever awful horror overcame her in the night, whatever danger, he wouldn't hear, he wouldn't know. He would still lie there content. Content. "How good you are," she said to Weems, her red eyes filling. "What would I have done without you?" "What would I have done without you?" he answered. And they stared at each other, astonished at the nature of the bond between them, at its closeness, at the way it seemed almost miraculously to have been arranged that they should meet on the crest of despair and save each other. Till long after the stars were out, they sat together on the edge of the cliff, Weems smoking while he talked, in a voice subdued by the night and the silence and the occasion, of his life and the regular healthy calm with which it had proceeded till a week before. Why, this calm. Weems is now, like, living in her house. He just, like, grabbed all his stuff from the hotel and just, like, invited himself to sleep on the couch. And she is, like, super devoted to him now. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Things are moving real fast. And she's, like, super, like, enamored and uses him for, like, everything. Ba, 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 ba. Mm-hmm. I lost my spot. That's okay. We'll start where I want to start. Till long after the stars were out, they sat together on the edge of the cliff, Weems smoking while he talked, in a voice subdued by the night, and the silence and the occasion of his life, and the regular healthy calm with which it had proceeded till a week ago. Why this calm should have been interrupted, and so cruelly, he couldn't imagine. It wasn't as if he had deserved it. He didn't know that a man could ever be justified in saying he had done good, but he, Weems, could at least fairly say that he hadn't done anyone any harm. "Oh, but you have done good," said Lucy, her voice, too, dropped into more than ordinary gentleness by the night, the silence, and the occasion, besides which it vibrated with feeling. It was lovely, with seriousness, with simple conviction. "Always, always, I know that you've been doing good," she said, "being kind. I can't imagine you anything else but a help to people and a comfort. They're vampires now. Change of story. Everybody's a vampire. And Weems said, well, he had done his best and tried, and no man could say more, but judging from what people had said to him, it hadn't been much of a success sometimes, and often he had been hurt, deeply hurt, by being misunderstood. And Lucy said, how was it possible to misunderstand him, to misunderstand anyone so transparently good, so evidently kind? And Weems said, yes, one would think he was easy enough to understand. He was a very natural, simple sort of person, who had only all his life asked for peace and quiet. It wasn't much to ask. Vera. Who is Vera? Asked Lucy. My wife. Oh, don't, said Lucy earnestly, taking his hand very gently in hers. Don't talk of that tonight, please. Don't let yourself think of it. If I could only take the words that would comfort you, only find the words that would comfort you. And Weems said that she didn't need words, that just her being there, being with him, letting him help her, and her not having been mixed up with anything more in his life, was enough. Aren't we like two children? He asked, his voice, like hers, deepened by feeling. Two scared, unhappy children clinging to each other alone in the dark. Excuse me. My throat got very dry. Little sippy break. So they talked on in subdued voices, as people do who are in some holy place, sitting close together, looking out at the starlit sea, darkness and coolness gathering round them, and the grass smelling sweetly after the hot day, and the little waves, such a long way down, lapping hazily along the shingle, till Weems said it must be long past bedtime, and she, poor girl, must badly need rest. How old are you? He asked suddenly, turning to her and scrutinizing the delicate faint outline of her face against the night. 22, said Lucy. You might just as easily be 12, he said, except for the sorts of things you say. It's my hair, said Lucy. My father liked... Don't, said Weems, in his turn, taking her hand. Don't cry again. Don't cry any more tonight. Come, we'll go in. It's time you were in bed. And he helped her up, and when they got into the light of the hall he saw that she had, this time, successfully strangled her tears. Good night, she said, when he had lit her candle for her. Good night, and God bless you. God bless you, said Weems, solemnly holding her hand in his great warm grip. He has, said Lucy. Indeed, he has already, in sending me you. And she smiled up at him, for the first time since he had known her, and he too had the feeling that he had known her forever, since he could remember. He saw her smile, and the difference it made to her marred, stained face surprised him. Do that again, he said, staring at her, still holding her hand. Do what? Asked Lucy. Smile. No. No. Don't, no. Don't ask people to smile. I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't like it. I'm uncomfortable. Then she laughed, but the sound of it in the silent, brooding house was shocking. No, please. Oh, she gasped, stopping short, hanging her head, appalled by what it had sounded like. Remember, you're to go to sleep and not think of anything, Weems ordered, as she went slowly upstairs. And she did fall asleep at once, exhausted, but protected. like some desolate baby that had cried itself sick and now had found its mother. Okay, so what did we learn? We learned that men have been asking women to smile since the 20s. And we're tap dancing around Stockholm right now. Yep. Man, we're starting early. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. So yeah, this book was controversial when it came out because Elizabeth was writing about her own marriage. So that's fun. Um, yeah. And we'll see where this goes. Um, like, is he see? That's what I'm wondering. That's what I'm wondering. I'm thinking that she is going to be his wife. Why not both? I'm thinking that, and I haven't read this before, so this is all just like pure guessing. But I think that they will get married and that it'll be terrible and awful. These are my thoughts. And I'm wondering, so I'm wondering if Elizabeth, the author, is supposed to be Vera, or, and if they do get married, if Lucy and Weems do get married, or if Elizabeth is supposed to be Lucy. I don't know. I don't know if that's what happens at all. I'm just purely guessing. I'm along for the ride. I'm flying by the seat of my pants over here. There's no more tea. Oh, okay. Let's see how much more uncomfortable we can get. Probably Lucy if Vera is dead. That's a good point. That's a good point. That makes sense. All right. Chapter 4. This will be the last chapter we have time for tonight. It's a longer one. So, gotta crack the old fingers. Let's see just how uncomfy we can get. We're only 8% of the way through the book, and we're already like cringing. So, get a blankie, people. Get a blankie. Chapter 4. All this, however, came to an end next day when Lucy. Let's start over. All this, however, came to an end next day when towards evening Miss Entwistle, Lucy's aunt, arrived. If cringe were a clock, we're at one-ish right now. And Falcourt. That's exactly what I'm imagining. Milton, hello. Thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Hi, hi, hi. Things are getting cringy. Let's do this. Weems retired to his hotel again and did not reappear till next morning, giving Lucy time to explain him. But either the aunt was inattentive, as she well might be under the circumstance in which she found herself so suddenly, so lamentably placed, or Lucy's explanations were vague. For Miss Entwistle took Weems for a friend of her dear Jim's, one of her dear, dear brother's many friends, and accepted his services as natural, and himself with emotion, warmth, and reminiscence. Who told you about my junior prom? Oh. Weems immediately became her rock as well as Lucy's, and she, in turn, clung to him. Where he had been clung to by one, he was now clung to by two, which put an end to talk alone with Lucy. He did not see Lucy alone again once before the funeral, but at least, owing to Miss Entwistle's inability to do without him, he didn't have to spend any more solitary hours. Except breakfast, he had all his meals up in the little house on the cliff, and in the evenings smoked his pipe under the mulberry tree till bedtime sent him away again, while Miss Entwistle, in the darkness, gently and solemnly reminisced, and Lucy sat silent, as close to him as she could get. The funeral was hurried on by the doctor's advice, but even so, the short notice and the long distance did not prevent James Entwistle's friends from coming to it. The small church down in the cove was packed. The small hotel bulged with concerned, grave-faced people. Weems, who had done everything and been everything, disappeared in this crowd. Nobody noticed him. None of James Entwistle's friends happened, luckily, he felt, with last week's newspapers still fresh in the public mind, to be his. For 24 hours he was swept entirely away from Lucy by this surge of mourners, and at the service in the church could only catch a distant glimpse from his seat by the door of her bowed head in the front pew. He felt very lonely again. He wouldn't have stayed in the church a minute, for he objected with a healthy impatience to the ceremonies of death, if it hadn't been that he regarded himself as the stage manager, so to speak, of these particular ceremonies, and that it was in a peculiarly peculiar oh my gosh, you know what I'm saying. I have such a hard time saying this word. I think I had to say it last one too. Peculiarly. We're gonna pretend that I said it perfectly. Most peculiar. There we go. I'm just gonna change it with most peculiar. Was in a most peculiar, intimate sense his funeral. He took a pride in it. Considering the shortness of the time, it really was a remarkable achievement, the way he had done it, the smooth way the whole thing was going. But tomorrow, what would happen tomorrow, when all these people had gone away again? Would they take Lucy and the aunt with them? Would the house up there be shut, and he, Weems, left alone again with his bitter, miserable recollections? He wouldn't, of course, stay on in that place if Lucy were to go, but wherever he went, there would be emptiness without her gratefulness, and gentleness, and clinging. Ooh, comforting and being comforted. That is what he and she had been doing to each other for 4 days, and he couldn't but believe she would feel the same emptiness without him that he knew he was going to feel without her. In the dark, under the mulberry tree, while her aunt talked softly and sadly of the past, Weems had sometimes laid his hand on Lucy's, and she had never taken hers away. They had sat there, content and comforted to be hand in hand. She had the trust in him, he felt, of a child, the confidence and the knowledge that she was safe. He was proud and touched to know it, and it warmed him through and through to see how her face lit up whenever he appeared. Vera's face hadn't done that. Vera had never understood him, not with 15 years to do it in, as this girl had in half a day. And the way Vera had died, it was no use mincing matters when it came to one's own thoughts. It had been all of a piece with her life. The disregard for others and of anything said to her of her own good, the determination to do what suited her, to lean out of dangerous windows if she wished to, for instance, not to take the least trouble, the least thought. Again, I apologize. Clearly, Weems is not an amazing person. Why couldn't my wife be more like this grieving, vulnerable 22-year-old child? Why couldn't my wife be more clingy, like this doe-eyed child? Ugh. Ugh. Imagine bringing such horror on him, such unforgettable horror, besides worries and unhappiness without end, by deliberately disregarding his warnings, his orders indeed about that window. Weems did feel that if one looked at the thing dispassionately, it would be difficult to find indifference to the wishes and feelings of others going further. It's very gross. It's gross. Mm. Sitting in the church during the funeral service, his arms folded on his chest and his mouth grim with these thoughts, he suddenly caught sight of Lucy's face. The priest was coming down the aisle in front of the coffin on the way out to the grave, and Lucy and her aunt were following first behind it. Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up, and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as if it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. The priest's sad, disillusioned voice recited the beautiful words as he walked, the afternoon sun from the west window and the open west door pouring on his face and on the faces of the procession that seemed all black and white, black clothes, white faces. The whitest face was Lucy's, and when Weems saw the look on it, his mouth relaxed, and his heart went soft within him, and he came impulsively out of the shadow and joined her, boldly walking on her other side at the head of the procession, and standing beside her at the grave, and at the awful moment when the first earth was dropped on to the coffin, he drew her hand before everybody through his arm and held it there tight. Nobody was surprised at his standing there with her like that. It was taken quite for granted. He was evidently a relation of poor Jim's. Nor was anybody surprised when Weems, not letting her go again, took her home up the cliff, her arm in his just as though he were the chief mourner, the aunt following with someone else. He didn't speak to her or disturb her with any claims on her attention, partly because the path was very steep and he wasn't used to cliffs, but also because of his feelings that he and she, isolated together by their sorrows, understood without any words. And when they reached the house, the first to reach it from the church, just as if, he couldn't help thinking, they were coming back from their wedding. He told her in his firmest voice to go straight up to her room and lie down, and she obeyed with the sweet obedience of perfect trust. No! Who is that? Asked the man who was helping Miss Entwistle up the cliff. Oh, a very old friend of darling Jim's, she sobbed. She had been sobbing without stopping from the first words of the burial service, and was quite unable to leave off. Mr. Weems. Weems? I don't remember coming across him with Jim. Oh, one of his oldest friends, sobbed poor Miss Entwistle, got completely out of control. Weems, continuing in his role of chief mourner, was the only person who was asked to spend the evening up at the bereaved house. I don't wonder, said Miss Entwistle to him at dinner, still with tears in her voice, at my dear brother's devotion to you. You have been the greatest help, the greatest comfort. And neither Weems nor Lucy felt equal to explanation. What did it matter? Lucy, fatigued by emotions, her mind bruised by the violent demands that had been made on it the last 4 days, sat drooping at the table, and merely thought that if her father had known Weems, it would certainly have been true that he was devoted to him. He hadn't known him. He had missed him by just 3 hours, and this wonderful friend of hers was the very first good thing that she and her father hadn't shared. And Weems's attitude was simply that if people insist on jumping at conclusions, why, let them. He couldn't anyhow begin to expound himself in the middle of a meal with a parlor maid handing dishes round and listening. But there was an awkward little moment when Miss Entwistle tearfully wondered. She was eating blancmange, the last of a series of cold and pallid dishes with which the imaginative cook, a woman of Celtic origin, had expressed her respectful appreciation of the occasion, whether when the will was read it wouldn't be found that Jim had appointed Mr. Weems, poor Lucy's guardian. Words, please be easier. Signed, Nudes. It would be great if they were easier. And yet, here they are. I am, dear me, how very hard it is to remember to say I was my dear brother's only relative. We belonged to an ex- exiguous family, exiguous family, and naturally I'm no longer as young as I was. There is only was only a year between Jim and me, and at any moment I may be. Here Miss Entwistle was interrupted by a sob and had to put down her spoon. Taken, she finished after a moment, during which the other two sat silent. When this happens, she went on presently, a little recovered, poor Lucy will be without any one, unless Jim thought of this and has appointed a guardian. You, Mr. Weems, I hope and expect. Neither Lucy nor Weems spoke. There was the parlor maid hovering, and one couldn't anyhow go into explanations now which ought to have been made 4 days ago. A dead white cheese was handed round. Something local, probably, for it wasn't any form of cheese with which Weems was acquainted, and the meal ended with cups of intensely black cold coffee. And all these carefully thought-out expressions of the cook's sympathy were lost on the three, who noticed nothing. Certainly they noticed nothing in the way the cook had intended. Dead white cheese. Spot on with the cheese detail. Weems was privately a little put out by the coffee being cold. He had eaten all the other clammy things patiently, but a man likes his after-dinner coffee hot, and it was new in his experience to have it served cold. He did notice this, and was surprised that neither of his companions appeared to. But there, women were notoriously insensitive to food. On this point, the best of them were unintelligent, and the worst of them were impossible. Vera had been awful about it. He had had to do all the ordering of the meals himself at last, and also the engaging of the cooks. I am horrible with meals, let me tell you. I don't know anything about food. He got up from the table to open the door for the ladies, feeling inwardly chilled, feeling, as he put it to himself, slabby inside, and left alone with a dish of black plums and some sinister-looking wine in a decanter, which he avoided because when he took hold of it, ice clinked. He rang the bell as unobtrusively as he could and asked the parlor maid in a subdued voice, the French window to the garden being open and in the garden being Lucy and her aunt, whether there were such a thing in the house as a whiskey and soda. The parlor maid, who was a nice-looking girl and much more at home, as she herself was the first to admit, with gentlemen than with ladies, brought it to him, and inquired how he had liked the dinner. Not at all, said Weems, whose mind on that point was clear. No, sir, said the parlor maid, nodding sympathetically. No, sir. She then explained in a discreet whisper, also with one eye on the open window, how the dinner hadn't been an ordinary dinner, and it wasn't expected that it should be enjoyed, but it was the cook's tribute to her late master's burial day, a master they had only known a week, sad to say, but to whom they had both taken a great fancy. Reed, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. I think so. I think it is an innuendo. Much more at home with gentlemen than ladies. I think that's what that implication is. A master they had only known a week, sad to say, but to whom they had both taken a great fancy. He being so pleasant spoken, and all for giving no trouble. Weems listened, sipping the comforting drink and smoking a cigar. Very different, said the parlor maid, who seemed glad to talk, would the dinner have been if the cook hadn't liked the poor gentleman. Why, in one place where she and the cook were together, and the lady was taken just as the cook would have given notice if she hadn't been because she was such a very dishonest and unpunctual lady. Besides not knowing her place, no lady, of course, and never was, when she was taken, not suddenly like this poor gentleman, but bit by bit, On the day of her funeral, the cook set up a dinner you'd never think of. She was like that, all fancy. Lucky it was that the family didn't read between the lines, for it began with fried soles. The parlor maid paused, her eye anxiously on the window. Weems sat staring at her. "Did you say fried soles?" he asked, staring at her. "Soles, S-O-L-E-S." "Oh, thank you so much for treating little Bean. He appreciates it." "Yes, sir. Fried soles. I didn't see anything in that either at first. It's how you spell it makes the difference," Cook said. And the next course was, her voice dropped almost to inaudibleness, deviled bones. Weems hadn't so much as smiled for nearly a fortnight, and now, to his horror, for what could it possibly sound like to the two mourners on the lawn, he gave a sudden, dreadful roar of laughter. He could hear it sounding hideous himself. The noise he made horrified the parlor maid as much as it did him. She flew to the window and shut it. Weems, in his effort to strangle the horrid thing, choked and coughed, his table napkin up to his face, his body contorted. He was very red, and the parlor maid watched him in terror. He had seemed at first to be laughing, though what Uncle Weems, thus did he figure in the conversation of the kitchen, could see to laugh at in the cook's way of getting her own back, the parlor maid, whose flesh had crept when she first heard the story, couldn't understand. But presently she feared he wasn't laughing at all, but was being, in some very robust way, ill. Dread seized her, death's being on her mind, lest perhaps here in the chair so convulsively struggling behind a table napkin were the beginnings of yet another corpse. Having flown to shut the window, she now flew to open it, and ran out panic-stricken into the garden to fetch the ladies. This cured Weems. He got up quickly, leaving his half-smoked cigar and his half-drunk whiskey, and followed her out just in time to meet Lucy and her aunt hurrying across the lawn towards the dining-room window. "I choked," he said, wiping his eyes, which indeed were very wet. "Choked?" repeated Miss Entwistle anxiously. "We heard a most strange noise." "That was me choking," said Weems. "It's all right. It's nothing. It's all right," he added to Lucy, who was looking at him with a face of extreme concern. But he felt now that he had had about as much of the death and funeral atmosphere as he could stand. Reaction had set in, and his reactions were strong. He wanted to get away from woe, to be with normal, cheerful people again, to have done with conditions in which a laugh was the most improper of sounds. Here he was, being held down by the head, he felt, in a black swamp. First, that ghastly business of Vera's, and now this woe-begone family. Sudden and violent was Weems's reaction, let loose by the parlor-maid's story. Miss Entwistle's swollen eyes annoyed him. Even Lucy's pathetic face made him impatient. It was against nature, all this. It shouldn't be allowed to go on. It oughtn't to be encouraged. Heaven alone knew how much he had suffered, how much more he had suffered than the Entwistles with their perfectly normal sorrow, than if he could feel it was high time, now, to think of other things. Surely the Entwistles could. He was tired of funerals. He had carried this one through really brilliantly from start to finish, but now it was over and done with, and he wished to get back to naturalness. Death seemed to him highly unnatural. The mere fact that it only happened once to everybody showed how exceptional it was, thought Weems, thoroughly disgusted with it. Why couldn't he and the Entwistles go off somewhere tomorrow? Away from this place altogether, go abroad for a bit, to somewhere cheerful, where nobody knew them and nobody would expect them to go about with long faces all day. Ostend, for instance. His mood of sympathy and gentleness had for the moment quite gone. He was indignant that there should be circumstances under which a man felt as guilty over a laugh as over a crime. A natural person like himself looked at things wholesomely. It was healthy and proper to forget horrors, to dismiss them from one's mind. If convention, that offspring of cruelty and hypocrisy, insisted that one's misfortune should be well rubbed in, that one should be forced to smart under them, and that the more one was seen to wince, the more one was regarded as behaving creditably. If convention insisted on this, and it did insist, as Weems had been experiencing himself since Vera's accident, why then it ought to be defied. He had found he couldn't defy it himself, and came away solitary and wretched in accordance with what it expected. But he felt quite different now that he had Lucy and her aunt as trusting friends who looked up to him, who had no doubts of him and no criticisms. Health of mind had come back to him, his own natural wholesomeness, which had never deserted him in his life till this shocking business of Vera's. "I'd like to have some sensible talk with you," he said, looking down at the two small black figures and solemn, tired faces that were growing dim and wraith-like in the failing light of the garden. With me or with Lucy?" asked Miss Entwistle. "I know that you've just had your father's funeral, but I'm tired of being sad now. So can you, knock it off?" Those are the exact vibes he's giving off. How dare they continue to be sad the same day that the funeral is happening? By this time, they both hung on his possible wishes and watched him with the devout attentiveness of a pair of dogs. "With you and with Lucy," said Weems, smiling at the upturned faces. He felt very conscious of being the male, of being in command. It was the first time he had called her Lucy. To Miss Entwistle it seemed a matter of course, but Lucy herself flushed with pleasure, and again had the feeling of being taken care of, and safe. Sad as she was at the end of that sad day, she still was able to notice how nice her very ordinary name sounded in this kind man's voice. She wondered what his own name was, and hoped it was something worthy of him, not Albert, for instance. "Shall we go into the drawing-room?" asked Miss Entwistle. "Why not to the mulberry tree?" said Weems, who naturally wished to hold Lucy's little hand, if possible, and could only do that in the dark. So they sat there, as they had sat other nights, Weems in the middle and Lucy's hand, when it got dark enough, held close and comfortingly in his. "This little girl," he began, "must get the roses back into her cheeks." Indeed she must," agreed Miss Entwistle, a catch in her voice at the mere reminder of the absence of Lucy's roses, and consequently of what had driven them away. "How do you propose we set about it?" asked Weems. "Time," gulped Miss Entwistle. "Time?" "And patience. We must both wait patiently till time has softened." She hastily pulled out her handkerchief. No, said Weems. "I don't at all agree. It isn't natural. It isn't reasonable to prolong sorrow. You'll forgive plain words, Miss Entwistle, but I don't know any others, and I say it isn't right to wallow, yes, wallow, in sorrow. Far from being patient, one should be impatient. One shouldn't wait resignedly for time to help one. One should up and take time by the forelock. In cases of this kind, and believe me, I know what I'm talking about, it was here that his hand, and the one on the further side from Entwistle, descended gently on Lucy's, and she made a little movement closer up to him. It is due to oneself to refuse to be knocked out. Courage, spirit, is what one must aim at. Setting an example. Weems is the worst. Ah, how wonderful he was, thought Lucy. So big, so brave, so simple, and so tragically recently himself the victim of the most awful of catastrophes. There was something burly about his very talk. Her darling father and his friends had talked quite differently. Their talk used to seem as if it ran about the room like liquid fire. It was so quick and shining. Often it was quite beyond her till her father afterwards, when she asked him, explained it, put it more simply for her, eager as he always was that she should share and understand. She could understand every word of Weems's. When he spoke, she hadn't to strain, to listen with all her might. She hardly had to think at all. She found this immensely reposeful in her present state. Yes, murmured Miss Entwistle into her handkerchief. Yes, you're quite right, Miss Weems. One ought, it would be more heroic. But if one has loved someone very tenderly, as I did my dear brother, and Lucy, her most precious father. What? Honey Lemon, I would never swear. I love that you come out of your streamer corner just for that. Honey Lemon, I have never sworn in my life, and I will never swear ever again. This stream is extremely PG, and gosh darn it, I'm sticking to it. She broke off and wiped her eyes. Perhaps, she finished, you haven't ever loved anybody very, very particularly and lost them. Coupled with this book, the most wholesome. Oh, breathed Lucy at that and moved still closer to him. Weems was deeply injured. Why should Miss Entwistle suppose he had never particularly loved anybody? He seemed, on looking back, to have loved a great deal. Certainly he had loved Vera with the utmost devotion, till she herself wore it down. He indignantly asked himself what this maiden lady would know of love. But there was Lucy's little hand, so clinging, so understanding, nestling in his. It soothed him. There was a pause. Then he said, very gravely, my wife died only a fortnight ago. Miss Entwinkle was crushed. Oh, she cried, but you must forgive me. End of chapter 4. I'm getting such creepy vibes. Creepy, cringy, upsetting vibes by dear old Weems. Also, Lucy doesn't even know his name? He's been staying at her house. I mean, on the couch, but on the couch, staying at her house, and she's like, I hope to know his name very soon. Hopefully it's not Albert. Like, girl, what? Mm. Lucy, stop it. Oh. Oh, hello, Red Dallas. Hello, hello. Oh. Oh, no. uh, all right. So I'm imagining things are only gonna get worse with Weems. I feel like this book shouldn't be categorized as controversial. It's straight up problematic. Yes. Yeah, like when they said that it came out with like controversy because like it could be seen as the um like Elizabeth's like actual husband. It's like, oh, okay, you just have to read really deeply into it and you wouldn't know unless like you were alive in 1921 and you like knew these people, but no. Mm-mm. It's very blatantly Weems is a problem. Mm. Oh, Red Tellus, thank you so much for the hydrate. Always coming in with a hydrate, and I love it. I thank you so much for it. All right. So, no likey. No likey. Okay, now that we know this, I and I know that this is like like I've heard people say that or like seen people write that this is like a suspense or a thriller, and I'm wondering if, again, never read this book. I do not know what actually happens. These are complete guesses. If you've read it, Don't tell me. Um, but I'm wondering if Lucy is going to like find something about him or realize that he's terrible and like I don't know and like try to off him. I don't know. I don't know. He doesn't seem to be a calculating predator, just incredibly self-absorbed. Yeah, like yes, I would agree with that. I think he just really loves the attention and he will get it from anybody. And because Lucy was the person who did that, who is like doe-eyed, maybe 12, maybe 22, is like looking up to him and like leaning on him so much for comfort and support that he loves that he can just be that person and I think ultimately going to like control her is what it seems like. And how how does her aunt not realize that no, this isn't a friend? I I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't know. And if he was a friend, wouldn't Lucy like and I honestly don't know. But if he was like a good friend of Lucy's dad, wouldn't Lucy call him by his first name? Like that would be like a red flag for me. Or like a nickname. I'm assuming she's calling him like Mr. Weems. Um so like if I was somebody's aunt or somebody's friend and I come over and my friend is calling this person who sleeps on the couch Mr. something, I don't understand. Oh, you're right, Pantath. Yes, you're right. 1921 is when it was written. I don't know if it's set in a different year, but I am guessing that it is about that time period. It was published in 1921. You're right. Yeah, parents, friends, definitely like a Mr. Mrs. All right, fine. Fine. Hmm. I don't like it though. I still don't like it. He might. I don't know. That's a good question. No idea. There's so many issues here. I'll give them that one. Fair. All right, fair. They're just so they think that they I think there is a will and they haven't read it yet. Or maybe there wasn't a will, I don't know. But Lucy's aunt, Miss Entwinkle, is thinking that if there was a will, or if it had been read, I don't remember which, that because Weems is so close to the family and so close to Lucy, that he would be the guardian. So, yes. Yes, they are just making that assumption. And, like what Weems said, like, if people are just going to assume things, like, why correct them when things are clearly icky and should be corrected? But it's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's great. And this is a super happy, unproblematic book that I didn't get chills from being creeped out multiple times. It's fine. It's fine. So yeah, that was the first couple chapters. Oh, I didn't look to see how far we are in the book. Let's see. And this is sort of misleading because there are like no exactly. There are publication notes at the end. So the percentage is going to be a little bit off, but we are 13% of the way through. So, ish. But yeah, that was the first three chapters, first four chapters, excuse me. We will be back on Thursday. Same time, same place. 4 p.m. Reading this book. Thanks. Yeah, I'm here for the cringe. I'm here for the upsetting and for the outrage discussion that follows after each upsetting cringe. But yeah, that's gonna be it for me today. We'll be continuing the story. on Thursday, 4 p.m. Central. I will also be streaming on Friday morning for reading sprints. But yeah, if I don't see you Thursday, I hope to see you a lot. Death memes. Exactly. I hope to see you all very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, thank you so much for supporting the stream. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you. Oh my gosh, don't even worry about it, Falcor. Don't even worry about it. Thank you all so much. Bye.